Today, we should note that a 120-mile, 7-day march of protesters continues from the site where Michael Brown was shot on Canfield Avenue in Ferguson to the Missouri governor's mansion in Jefferson City. For more on Ferguson and the state of racial relations here in the United States, we are joined by James Peterson, Director of Africana Studies at Lehigh University. He is here in studio, and by Ta-Nehisi Coates of The Atlantic, who joins us from New York. Now, let me ask you, the president of the NAACP, who is leading this march, who has compared it to the 1965 Selma to Montgomery March. Will there be change?
I think ultimately we have to remain hopeful about having some change around some of the things that Mr. Crump was talking about. Maybe this body camera law, maybe some progress, revising and rethinking the grand jury process might be useful around these particular kinds of cases. But I don't want to compare what's going on now to the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement is its own awesome history and its own sort of impact on American society. Sometimes we get so caught up in what the accomplishments were of the civil rights movement that it obscures our capacity to understand the work that we have to do now. What's going on now across this nation, young people and people from all different backgrounds who are organizing peacefully and protesting peacefully around these particular issues, there's got to be a certain set of outcomes for what is happening now. And so we can't get too confused and confounded by what's happened in the past. We have to be forward thinking, I think.
Ta-Nehisi, we have the first black president. We have the first attorney general. We heard President Obama, after the grand jury's decision, say we need to accept that this decision was the grand jury's to make. Do you agree with that?
Well, we have no real choice but to accept that it was the grand jury's to make. We live in a society where there's a process, and being law-abiding people, we have to follow it. But going back to your earlier question about whether we can expect change, I have to say I'm a little skeptical of that. I think police departments in this country represent a larger relationship between American society and black communities. And so the question for me is, what is Ferguson, the town of Ferguson, the black population of Ferguson's relationship with the larger community around it? And I think it's all good to begin the conversation at the point at which there's a lethal confrontation between Michael Brown and Officer Wilson. But why was Officer Wilson stopping Michael Brown for walking down the street? How did we get to that point? We have some pretty good studies on the amount of policing that's endured by African American communities in Ferguson and how that relates to how
my understanding is that
surrounding counties fund themselves.
Yeah, Ta-Nehisi, my understanding though was that he had just received over the radio the report that there had been a robbery and there was a description of a suspect, and that when Michael Brown walked by, he fit that description, and that's why he stopped him on that particular case.
See, some of that's unclear. Officer Wilson says
my understanding was that he was
jury.
actually walking in the middle of the street, and he hadn't put that together yet.
Right.
Am I correct?
Well, there's confusion because Officer Wilson in the grand jury says he connects those two things. The chief of police of Ferguson actually did not connect those two things, and so this is why you have to have a transparent trial by jury. And I agree with Ta-Nehisi that we can't be too hopeful about change because of the structural things that are in place and the long, hard work that has to happen here. What Ta-Nehisi is talking about in terms of police stops and the bias in the system is thinking about how racial bias informs all these things.
So I know you two know this, but one of the things that struck me, of course, Ferguson is 67% black. The police force of 53 officers, only 3 of them are black. And so I went and looked across the country. I mean, this is so common.
Yes.
In fact, in 3/4 of U.S. cities, there are a higher percentage of white officers than, of course, in the population. Is this fundamental to what's at stake here in terms of the distrust between communities and police officers?
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, it's a part of it, but diversifying the police department, I don't think will automatically cure it. There's a district right outside of Washington, D.C., where you guys are, Prince George's County, that is known as having one of the most brutal police departments in the country. It's a majority black town. It's a majority black affluent population there. Black cops can be brutal too, and
Absolutely.
I don't think we should get blinded to that. It's definitely a step forward, but it's not a cure-all.
Mm-hmm.
It's not. Again, we're talking about racial bias here, and unfortunately, racial bias affects everyone. It's just that when you are choosing whether or not you're going to use lethal force, the consequences of it are oftentimes awful, and so that's why we have. Again, it's a long haul here. There has to be a a way in which we can train officers of the law to think less about using lethal force, to understand how bias shapes how they're going to interact with certain people of color and young people and poor people, and we have to train them as such. Without that kind of overhaul, we're not going to see the change I think that needs to happen out of this particular situation.
Ta-Nehisi, I want to ask you about something you wrote this week. You said what clearly cannot be said is that violence and nonviolence are tools, and that violence, like nonviolence, sometimes works. Taken together, property damage and looting have been the most effective tools of social progress for white people in America. What did you mean by that?
Well, I meant that's just American history. I mean, the fact of the matter is you can take it from, the broader perspective of America. I think these people have this idea that the American Revolution was like the Tea Party was an actual Tea Party. It was somehow nonviolent. The fact of the matter is the roots of this country are, in fact, very, very violent. Enslavement, which is at the roots of this country. The black population in this country was enslaved longer than it's been free. That's at the basis of who we are. The theft of land from Native Americans is at the basis of who we are. So when we talk about all the things that we love about America, democracy, freedom, et cetera, I don't think that we should lose sight of how, the foundation on which those things were built, and they were not built nonviolently. That is not, to say that looting is right, that looting is correct, but I think that, when the government, which, often acts violently towards African Americans, turns around and lectures black people about nonviolence, we have a right to be skeptical of that.
Mm-hmm. I want to end on this photo that has gone viral. It's of a 12-year-old, Devonte Hart, who was in tears. It was at a Ferguson protest rally in Portland, Oregon, and you can see this officer, Sergeant Brett Barnum, who is white, hugging this child. It has been shared more than 150,000 times on Facebook. What does that say to you, that photo, and how it's been shared so many times on Facebook?
I think the photo shows us that people are very hopeful and maybe a little bit naive about a better relationship between the African American community and the police forces that are charged with protecting them. Unfortunately, a photo op is not what's going to get it done. It's going to take the long, hard work of understanding how racial bias informs certain kinds of decisions, the representational piece that you were talking about in terms of law enforcement, overhauling grand juries. I mean, we're talking about structural change that has to occur. The photo is beautiful, and the reason why people are sharing it because it reflects some hope about a certain kind of situation. But we don't need to be concerned as much about hope as we do about the sort of nitty-gritty of getting down to the work of changing these systems.
All right, Dr. James Peterson, Ta-Nehisi Coates, good to have both of you here. Thank you.
Thank you, Nora.
Thanks for having me, Nora.
And we'll be back in a minute.